The mescaline experiments, for instance, this was something Nazis were doing on Jews in concentration camps.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. LSD, Lysergic acid diethylamide. Erowid.com describes it as a standard by which all other psychedelic drugs are judged. But LSD was only discovered a few decades ago in the laboratory of Dr. Albert Hoffman, while plant-based psychedelics have been part of human culture for millennia. But somehow, it was LSD that changed the world. Alexis Turner is here to tell us all about the early days of that tumultuous history. Turner is a historian of science at Harvard who writes about the political and scientific history of LSD. As you'll be able to tell, I personally enjoyed this conversation very much. The history of LSD from the 40s through the 70s is something I've spent a good bit of time studying. So to talk to someone who has spent a great deal of time on it was wonderful. With a dissertation titled Lost Souls Delivered, LSD, Technopolitics, and the Battle for the Spirit of a Nation, Turner has dug into archives all over the country to learn more about the web of therapists, scientists, and spooks who rolled out LSD and how their politics affected how that molecule changed the nation. We'll talk about what it was like for Hoffman to discover such a powerful drug, how the therapists interacted with this curious new psychoactive, and how the CIA was interested from the very beginning. So if you want the straight story about LSD and a sober analysis from a truly charming and funny speaker, you're sure to enjoy this conversation with Alexis Turner. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today with Alexis Turner, who is a student of LSD and its history. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the first question I wanted to ask you was, I assume that when you were little, you weren't saying you wanted to study the history of LSD. So what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be like 4 or 5 different things, and weirdly, becoming a historian of LSD lets me do all of them. I wanted to be an actor for a while, which is very weird because I'm actually kind of shy. But teaching and doing things like this allow me to act a little bit. I wanted to be a writer, and here I am writing a book. I also wanted to be a detective, and so being a historian lets me scratch that particular itch because I get to dig around in dead people's letters all day. And sort of in keeping with that, I wanted to be a spy, and I feel like those are some of the same impulses as well. So I get to do all of those things.
Especially the spy craft part. Reading the history of LSD, you learn a lot about how spies worked in the 40s through the 60s and 70s.
Oh yeah, and I'm a little ambivalent about that part of it, which is strange since I was so fascinated with it as a child. But it's so hard to dig into that history because so much of it is hidden and was intentionally obfuscated. And it has a way of imparting this paranoid mindset to anyone who tries to dig into that history. And I am not terribly eager to turn myself into that kind of a person. So I'll dabble in that for a few weeks or a month, and then I'll sort of pull back in horror as I find myself becoming suspicious of literally everything I read.
It's true. Once you start learning about how much the government did torturous psychedelic experiments on unwitting citizens, it really makes you question everything about what has been going on for decades now.
Yeah. And this is something I think that's actually relevant to the contemporary political scene as well. A lot of people express total bafflement as, oh, how can people believe these absurd, ridiculous conspiracy theories? And I'm like, well, a lot of the so-called conspiracy theories in the past turned out to be true, right? And it actually makes my job very hard because when I come across these theories, I can't discount them out of hand because the um, the government did give LSD to people who didn't know, and they toyed with the idea of using it as a weapon and spraying it on crowds that were protesting, for instance, to incapacitate them and be able to gain control of the crowd. They did decide that that was maybe not going to work the way they thought it would, and they did not carry forward with that, fortunately.
The one I did learn about was during the MK Ultra test. Was off the coast of San Francisco. They use an inactive ingredient, but they sprayed tons of it into the air just to see how well it would diffuse and to test the patterns. And one of the little bacteria that was in there sickened some of the people and killed one person in San Francisco. And no one of the doctors knew how this bacteria was getting into people. And it's because the CIA was running this test off on the entire city of San Francisco. And once you realize that they were willing to do that, it makes you wonder what they've done since.
Yeah. And I hadn't heard that one. That one's actually fascinating. I'm not surprised they had a number of allergists on their payroll. And this was one of the things that allergists were looking at, was how gases diffuse, for instance. And some of those guys actually invented the modern asthma inhaler. But I've heard stories that some of these CIA guys invented Lyme disease by accident, and the ticks got out of the laboratory, and we can owe that to them. And I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not saying it's true or not, but given the things I've studied, it's also not beyond the realm of possibility, which is terrifying to me.
And it seems like you're so well suited to this because as we look at your CV, you got first your BA in science from Sarah Lawrence, and then an MA in social science at U of Chicago, which is a great place to study social science, and then an MA in political science from Indiana University. So you have science, social science, and political science, and those all converge so well on everything that this gargantuan LSD molecule rolled out into the world. So how did you find yourself kind of coalescing around this molecule as the thing to study to bring together all your interests?
I didn't start out with an interest in psychedelics. I sort of tripped into it, or, well, that's not a good way, but I stumbled into it. And I was trying to figure out how to combine all of these interests, and my real interest, what I really want to understand, is political judgment. And there's two parts to that. The first is, when you look at a thing, how do you decide what the thing is? So if a person's looking at Donald Trump, for instance, what makes them say or not say, man, I'm looking at a fascist right now, right? So how do you decide what a thing is? And then let's say you decide Donald Trump is a fascist. What do you do about it? That's the second step of political judgment. Do you take to the streets and protest? Do you say, hey, that's my kind of a guy? Do you just rage tweet on Twitter? Right? There are hundreds of answers that you could come up with about what to do about Donald Trump being a fascist. So I was trying to figure out, well, how do I study that political judgment as a historian of science? And I couldn't figure it out. And my advisor was getting a little frustrated with me, and I was despondent and decided to go home and just not think about it for an evening. So I had a couple beers, which is often the start to these kinds of stories. I had a couple beers and decided I would watch my favorite movie of all time, Repo Man. So I started watching Repo Man. And I must have watched Repo Man 30 or 40 times in my 20s. And I never noticed before this evening that it's actually a really fantastic commentary on the failed political hopes of the 60s and 70s. So as I was watching this, I was like, well, okay, I could pick a project in the 60s and 70s. That's as good of a time period as any. Then I did this sort of petty, ridiculous thing that only a person in grad school could think up, which was, fuck Harvard, fuck graduate school, fuck academics, I'm gonna secretly write my dissertation as the plot of Repo Man. and so I got really into this idea. I was writing down every single scene. I'll just add that this is no longer the plan. It has since changed. But I was writing down every scene. And, and Marlena represents the Black Panthers, and Pleshner, this asshole security guard, is this wannabe Rambo, right wing, racist dude, and then you have the brothers, and there's this great scene where they're standing outside a store debating on what to do, and one of them tells the other one, "Hey man, look, we're just workers, we're mules. We just take it and don't ask any questions." And so they represent the Chicano labor movement, right? But I couldn't figure out who the punks represented because that was very much an 80s thing. And so they were bothering me. And then there's this scene where they're running down the street. They just stole all these drugs, and the drugs are pouring out of their arms as they're running down the street. And it just hit me. I was like, oh my God, everyone in this is fighting over LSD. That's the object that everyone in the 60s and 70s was battling over. And as soon as I decided that, I was like, oh, that's actually a good project. I didn't mean to come up with a good project like tonight. I wasn't even going to think about my project, and now I have a great project. So that's how I stumbled on LSD. And since I actually came across Michael Nesmith's autobiography, Infinite Tuesday, he produced Repo Man, and half the book is about his experiences with LSD, and he and Jack Nicholson hanging out and taking LSD together. And so when I came across that, I was like, wow, there's some kismet or something involved in this. This was like a really good choice.
Wow, so that's how it came.
It did. 6 months after I had picked the project is when I suddenly started seeing it appearing in the news all of a sudden. And so it was just a tremendous coincidence that I stumbled into it just as it was popping up on everyone else's radar. I lucked into it very much.
And then the title became Lost Souls Delivered, LSD, Technopolitics, and the Battle for the Spirit of a Nation.
It did. I have a different working title at the moment. Although my advisor and I have been going around and around on it, so I keep putting this boring title that she likes. But in my mind, the title is actually Blowing Sunshine, which to me captures this cruel optimism. This is a term that the political theorist Lauren Berlant coined. Cruel optimism is where the hopes and optimisms you have for a thing encourage you to pursue it in exactly such a way that you do not get the thing you want. And that's the cruelty of the optimism. And from what I'm seeing of the pursuit of LSD in the 50s and 60s, it was pursued by scientists in a way that turned out to be a cruel optimism and was a strongly contributing factor in them eventually losing it. And so the blowing sunshine is both them blowing it, but also, blowing sunshine up our ass is about these amazing, fantastic, incredible utopian things that it was going to do for us. So I'm trying to sort of catch both of those with this title.
That's quite the double-edged sword. I was wondering if we could walk through the history a little bit slowly with the focus on the scientists who were doing the work and then how their politics affected the rollout of LSD in the real world. Perhaps starting with Albert Hoffman, just to explain to people who haven't heard much about the origins of LSD, how that came about, and how Sandoz helped release this to the world.
Sure. So there's this wonderfully apocryphal story, and Hoffman has told it. It seems a little too good to be true to me, but the story is that he developed this as a chemist at Sandoz Laboratory in the late 40s, excuse me, the late 30s, and was testing it on animals, but they didn't really react. If I recall, he gave it to some cats and they sort of stared off into space, but otherwise didn't do anything. Which, of course, now we would understand as them probably tripping really, really hard. But at the time, he didn't think it was doing anything. And he said that he had developed it to assist with uterine contractions, which to me sounds like he was making an abortifacient, but he's never said that I've come across. But I don't know what else he would want to be doing with uterine contractions. And some folks also thought it might help with migraines because it constricts blood vessels. So it didn't do that. He put it back up on the shelf. And then the strange part of the story is 5 years later, he just got a funny feeling about LSD 25. It was the 25th synthesis that he had done. This is how it got its name. So he resynthesized it. And in the process, he accidentally got a little like under his fingernail or something. And sure enough, not long after, he started tripping. But he didn't know what was happening because he hadn't realized he got it on himself. He thought he was going mad. So he managed to make it home, thought he was losing his mind, woke up the next morning and felt fantastic. And he's like, huh, I, I wonder if it was the LSD 25. So he went back to the office and together with a female assistant in the lab, redosed himself on purpose with what he thought was quite a small amount, but turns out was pretty magnificently large. Started riding his bicycle back home with the assistant, and about halfway there, he starts tripping again and gets home, and his neighbor's a witch, and he's just totally out of his mind, and wakes up the next morning and feels great again. And so that's how he discovered the hallucinogenic action of LSD. And for the next 4 to 5 years, and bear in mind, this is like 42, 43, 44 that they start working on this. This is the very end of, this is World War II. It's not as new of a drug as a lot of people think of. But they couldn't figure out what it was good for. And eventually a gentleman in his laboratory, the lab director's son, Werner Stoll, got the idea that maybe you could give it to schizophrenics because it seemed like it mimicked their psychosis. And so if you could give this psychotomimetic is what they started calling it. It mimics psychosis. If you could give it to the schizophrenics, maybe it would give you insight into the illness. And so he was actually the first person who finally published a paper about this. And I forget the exact year. I want to say it was like 47, 48. And psychopharmacology was very, very new then. And pharmaceutical companies didn't fully know what to do with these kinds of drugs. They didn't have a set in stone procedure for testing them yet. They weren't sure how much of a market was going to be in them. They were figuring it out as they went along. And so back then what they would do, and this was common, it wasn't just Sandoz, but a lot of the companies would send the drug for free to researchers and doctors and tell them, well, we think it might be good for this or that. And in the case of psychedelics, based on Stoll's paper, they said, we think it might be good for mimicking psychosis, or we think it might be good for studying consciousness. And we just don't know beyond that, really. So they'd send it out with this line. And in exchange, any research findings that the researchers came up with and published, they would have to send back to the company. And so basically, they were sort of crowdsourcing their research, right? Um, and that's how it's first came to the US. And there's a little debate about who got it first. Everyone wants to claim they were the first person. So one fellow was Max, and I've only seen his name written, so I may be butchering this, but Max Rinkel, Rinkel. He was at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, and he was the first person on the East Coast to get it in, I believe it was 1949. And right around the same time, Nicholas Purcell in Los Angeles got it. And Purcell messed around with it for a few years and eventually set it aside, but not before he had mentioned it to a lot of his friends out in Los Angeles. And they came across it other ways too. So in 1952, Oscar Janiger, he was a psychiatrist in Los Angeles. He got it after he heard about it when a student of his heard a lecture he gave where he was talking about the twilight state, which is the point just before you fall asleep and you're still conscious and you know what's going on, but you kind of start dreaming. And his student came up to him afterwards. Perry Bivens was the student. And he said, Dr. Janiger, I have a drug that I think you would be really interested in. And he and his girlfriend at the time, they later became married. He and his girlfriend went with Dr. Janiger to Dr. Janiger's retreat up in the San Bernardino Mountains. It was this cute little yellow cabin. And they gave him LSD. And he was blown away and decided he was going to devote the entire rest of his life to studying this. Actually, I said 52. It may have been 54. But pretty early on, he was definitely one of the very early, one of the early researchers in the U.S. to get a hold of this. And he said he was going to study it for the rest of his life, and that's exactly what he did. He gave it to between 54 and 62. Janiger probably gave it to upwards of 1,000 different people, which was very rare. Almost nobody gave it to that many people. So anyway, I could keep going, but I feel like surely you have other questions. I could just talk about these guys all day.
There's such a fascinating part of this because oftentimes therapists aren't the most outside the box thinkers, and those willing to mess around with drugs, trying them on themselves, working with patients with them. It seemed like this early batch of therapists really helped to set the stage of what the intelligentsia thinking was on this drug. In some ways, it seems like the late 50s was a golden period for LSD because it was mostly being taken by therapists, giving it out to people kind of in a nice, quiet underground. The cops had no idea about it yet. And it was starting to move up in the political sphere. People in DC were starting to get exposed to it through connections in Boston and places like that. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the late 50s and how LSD was starting to roll out to all of these different types of people.
Oh, yeah. And this is the period I've looked at the most so far in my research. And it's just a fascinating one. And the cops didn't know about it yet because it wasn't illegal, right? These guys were still getting it totally legally for free. It was flowing like wine. It was very easy to get a hold of directly from the manufacturer. And so in Janiger's case, for instance, Perry Bivens told him, oh, yeah, I got some, by writing to Sandoz, and it showed up on my doorstep like 2 weeks later. And he had a hyperbaric chamber that he had built himself in his backyard. He was a wealthy developer's son, so he could build toys for himself. And he was a scuba diver. So he had built this hyperbaric chamber and wanted to do experiments with LSD in the hyperbaric chamber. And so Janiger then rode off and got his own samples. And this was how most of those guys did it then. And you just had to tell them your study plan, and they would largely sign off on it. They didn't start getting squeamish until around 61 or 62. And so in LA, there were very many people taking it through psychiatrists. Janiger, for instance, had a setup where, because psychologists couldn't prescribe it, because they did have those rules about medication, you had to be a psychiatrist to prescribe it. So he had an arrangement with a number of psychologists who would send their patients to him to get it. And then he would have them write up trip reports after the fact about the experience, and he would use this as a way to collect data and gather research subjects. And then he turned that into a snowball sample, and he had the patients go tell their friends, and they would come to him and ask for it. And this is how he managed to get so many people. And so they would tell their friends. There were a lot of writers who happened into his study, and then they would write about it. I've come across probably at least a dozen or more who carried it into the public consciousness in one way or another. He had one fellow, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but he was a scriptwriter, and he wrote the script for the movie The Tingler, which is this very schlocky, wonderful film with Vincent Price, who's kind of a mad scientist who's trying to discover the root of fear. And it's the first movie I've ever found that mentions LSD by name. And it turns out the guy who wrote it was one of Janiger's research subjects, and that's how he learned about it. And so he inserted it as a plot point into this movie. And
wow, Rob White, I think.
Yes, that's it. Rob White was one of Oscar Janiger's research subjects.
Wow, so that's the first mention, the Tingler. That's great.
Yeah, I haven't found it in any films before that. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's the first one I've managed to come across. He gets some of the details wrong in these really charming ways. It's also the first time I've heard anyone call it acid, which was a mistake. It's not, in fact, an acid, but one of his characters is warning the other one, you've got to be really careful with that. It's an acid. It can really make you go insane and mess you up, and it's truly dangerous.
And that's actually a great question. I mean, what did you come across in terms of bad experiences, and perhaps ones that led to any lasting harm? Was there much of that in this more controlled therapeutic rollout?
There were a handful. We have to be realistic. I know a lot of proponents want to say that it can't do any harm whatsoever. That's not entirely true. But the numbers of bad experiences were quite low. Sidney Cohen, who was also a psychiatrist in Los Angeles at the time, he worked at the VA hospital there, and he also worked at UCLA. They were connected. Sid Cohen started out really eager and in the Oscar Janiger and the Aldous Huxley and the Gerald Hurd circles. And in the late 50s, he started getting a little disenchanted. He was especially put off by Al Hubbard, he's a gentleman who's been dubbed the Johnny Appleseed of LSD because he was really enthusiastic and gave it to everyone he possibly could. And Cohen realized at some point that he was a charlatan. He had a PhD, but it was fake. It was from a diploma mill, and nobody could verify any of the details from his background. And he everyone called him Cappy or Captain, and he would go around dressed in a military outfit all the time. And Cohen just decided he was a poser, and he wrote this rather snarky letter to a friend where he referred to, quote unquote, our hybridized citizens. So he started getting a little put off, and he started shifting away from some of the more intellectual circles and doctors, the more liberal doctors, and started moving into a more hard science approach. And why the hell did I start telling you that story?
Maybe as an example of the ones who would get disenchanted, because it's not a cure-all
the
for
dangers.
therapy.
Yes.
Oh, and the dangers. Mm-hmm.
So Cohen started having his doubts, and he decided he wanted to go about this in a much more methodical way than he felt like a lot of people had been doing it. And so he ran a study looking for adverse reactions. And he wrote to all of the scientists that he knew had been working with LSD to ask them about any adverse events that patients under their watch may have experienced. And he wrote to 60 something, maybe even more scientists, and their responses are in his archives at UCLA. And Janiger wrote back and had, I think, 2. And at that point, he'd given it to maybe 600 people or something. That's a pretty low incidence of bad effects, right? And one of them was a woman who freaked out and punched her hand through a window, and she had to go get some stitches in her hand. And the other one, Janiger included, and he said, I'm not even sure this is because of the LSD or not, but I'm including it for completeness. But about 2 weeks after I gave someone LSD, he tried to commit suicide. And I'm not sure if it's because of the LSD or not. I think it's probably not, honestly. And the other folks he wrote to as well, they hadn't had as many patients as Janiger, but most of them had no negative events to speak of. And the ones who did, it was a smattering. 1 or 2 people had convulsions or seizures. A couple people had suicidal ideation. And in some cases, it was more clearly directly connected to the experience. And then there was that, and then also going through all of the trip reports that Janiger saved in his files, I found a number of people who said that was the worst, most terrible experience of my life. But it was a very, very small number compared to the people who either said it was amazing and I loved it, or who said, yeah, it was fine and useful. Not sure I'd do it again, but I'm glad I did. That was the majority of the responses.
That makes sense, especially because once you expand that out to millions of doses across the US and more haphazard recreational usage, you're going to hear more of those negatives. And they so clearly exist. It is amazingly safe, how safe it tends to be. But to call it all the way safe is just silly. It's amazing how often you hear people claiming that when it's just not true. If you are in any scene that uses a lot of LSD, you see people who have, completely lost touch with reality because of experiences or experience, long-term damage from this. And it's too bad that it's swept under the carpet when it wasn't as swept under the carpet in the earlier research phases of this.
Right. And I also think as a teacher, I found in the classroom, if I try to say something that isn't true, or a student says something inconvenient that's true, and I try to deny its truth, it pisses them off, understandably, right? People don't like to be told BS. And so if someone says something true, and then I pretend like it isn't the case, or I try to refute it, they cling to it harder and they double down. And so if you want to get them past the point to understand the larger point, you have to recognize the truth of what they just said, right? You have to say, well, yes, but, and then add that, however. And the refusal to acknowledge the truth digs people into positions much harder. And I think you see this with our politics today, right? Nobody wants to make the first move of saying, well, okay, I guess that point was kind of true. However, they just jump straight to the however, and then nobody moves anywhere.
Hey folks, it's sponsor time. The company is CV Sciences, the product is Plus CBD, and the discount code for 20% off is Lex Files. And remember, the top 3 reasons to use that code on pluscbdoil.com. Number 1, I would give Plus CBD to your grandmother, because I gave it to my grandmother. Number 2, I was the biggest skeptic. Then I started studying the endocannabinoid system. Number 3, I know firsthand that CV Sciences is committed to pure science and to enhancing well-being. So when you find yourself in need of CBD from true agricultural hemp, consider Plus CBD, the number 1 CBD brand in the United States. That coupon code is LexFiles, and the place to use it is pluscbdoil.com. Speaking of truth, I wanted to go back to Captain Al Hubbard because he is such a notorious figure with his magic mayonnaise jar filled with LSD that he traveled everywhere with, because he was rumored to have CIA connections. And I don't think there's enough to either confirm or deny, though there's a new biography I haven't read yet that I'd like to dive into. But he speaks to the fact that even by the late 50s, the powers in the CIA had twigged on this, that there was something useful, because going all the way back to World War II, they were already testing mescaline and other drugs, strong cannabinoids on prisoners of war in really terrible experiments. And so that research continued. And once LSD started to get intriguing to them, that was the dark underside that started to develop. And so I was wondering if you could speak to what's known about the CIA getting into the research scene kind of quietly during this late 50s, early 60s phase.
Yeah, I mean, they actually, as far as I can tell, were in on it right from the very beginning, from the late 40s or early 50s. And part of that was, and this is an area I'm just starting to dig into more, so I'm a little hazier on it than some of the other areas, but the mescaline experiments, for instance, this was something Nazis were doing on Jews in concentration camps. And so when Americans went over and won the war and started taking over these places, they were confronted with a decision of, what do we do about the science of our enemies? And different countries responded to this in different ways, not just drug science, but rocket science, for instance. And with rockets, the Russians, for instance, brought in a number of former German scientists, but kept them under very, very close wraps and really didn't let them out of their sight. The US took a slightly different approach, was to bring in a lot of these scientists and say, all your sins are forgiven. We're going to pretend like you never did anything that you did. And in exchange, you just have to work for us. And we'll make you full-fledged American citizens. So this is how people like Werner von Braun, who became the head of the US's rocket program, and which eventually became NASA, this is how he came over. And this is how Sidney Gottlieb, who was a chemist and became the head of a lot of chemical weapons programs, came to the US. And they came over under something called Operation Paperclip.
Boo, hiss.
Yes. And so someone like Sid Gottlieb would have known about a lot of these experiments. And in the process of making this transition, other US scientists learned about it. And I just read about this guy the other day. So, of course, I forgot his name because I'm not eyeball deep in it quite yet. But a gentleman who went over and looked at a lot of the old papers for the mescaline experiments in particular, and he gave evidence at the Hague um, about war crimes. He was a neuropsychopharmacologist, and he ended up working on some of this stuff back in the U.S. And so the Nazi science came into U.S. scientific circles this way, and the attitude very much was like, well, oh my gosh, if they were trying to find truth serum drugs, we better start trying to find truth serum drugs and get there first. And in this way, we embraced a lot of highly questionable and ethically dubious, just to be very gentle about describing scientific knowledge, and brought it right into the heart of the U.S. scientific endeavor.
That's a great point, because it's an important part of the forces at work during that time that's easy for us to forget now. But the Cold War was getting very cold, and there was so much fear about the Russians winning in the psychopharmacology realm, which, you know, someone like Huxley would say is the most important one. And so there was this drive that we have to have these truth serums. And for anyone interested in this part of the story, a great book is Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. And it's a terrible look at how far America was willing to go to incorporate Nazis to try to beat the Russians, and the kind of technologies they were invested in. All of that crazy CIA tech that you've heard about over the years, a lot of this you can trace back to Sidney Gottlieb, who came here because of Operation Paperclip. And to return more to the therapist, how much do you think was known by these therapists giving out LSD about how involved the CIA was around this, especially at a time when the CIA had a much better reputation than it does now?
I get the sense that it was very mixed. So some guys were fully aware. The guys on the payroll, in particular, Harold Abramson was working for the CIA, and he knew he was working for the CIA. Other guys within their laboratories might not know where the paycheck was coming from. So I came across in a story the other day about a fellow who was working on this mystery red oil in his first laboratory as a graduate student, and they really didn't know what it was, but they had been directed to, I believe they were giving it to rats and then seeing what would happen. But he had a friend in the chemistry department, and he gave it to his chemist friend to try and figure out what it was, and his friend ran some tests, and it turns out it was THC. But the regular workers in the lab weren't given that information as part of their experiments. They were just testing it on rats to see what would happen. So even within the same lab, because of the way the secrecy protocols work, some people might know exactly what was going on and other people were largely ignorant. But there were parts of it that were an open secret. There was something interesting I came across in Janiger's papers, where he had these follow-up questionnaires with people, for instance. And he had a series of maybe like 12 to 18 things. Which of the following would LSD be good for? You know, having a religious experience. I can't even think of all of them right now. But one that really jumped out at me was brainwashing somebody. So the fact that people were trying to use LSD for brainwashing was, if not at the very least, it was an open secret. It may have just been like well known. That I'm not sure exactly how well known it was, but Janiger was never working for the CIA, but he clearly knew that people were using it to try this.
And I think one thing that's worth noting is that Gottlieb and cohorts spent, a decade or two trying to make LSD into the brainwashing drug and looking at all of these different drugs, and they never got it accomplished. They really, as far as we know, they didn't find a way to truly brainwash somebody and to make a Manchurian candidate who could act on orders. The other thing that's worth mentioning, just on the secrecy and how hard it is for a historian, is in 1973 when the CIA director Richard Helms, after Watergate, he burned a whole bunch of files. Pretty much, I believe what he destroyed was the files related to MK Ultra and his own personal files, so he wouldn't be implicated. And so much of this stuff we're never going to be able to piece together because it's only some of the smatterings of files found in other places that escaped the destruction. So we'll never really know how much the CIA did, but what we do know is immense. And so it's interesting to hear about how well known that might have been at the time and affecting the therapist doing the work.
Yeah, and I mean, you're exactly right, and this is exactly why it's so difficult from a historical perspective to piece together some of this stuff. And the files they did find, I guess, had been misfiled in like a room for budget files. So there were a small number that escaped destruction because somebody had put them in the wrong place or something. And then you might find the occasional mention here and there. I haven't looked at these myself yet, but I spoke with a researcher who had looked at George White's papers, and George White was the CIA agent responsible for the delightfully named Operation Midnight Climax. I don't know if you know this one. But this is where they basically built a brothel. It was a hotel room converted to have a one-way mirror in it. And George White would sit behind this one-way mirror with a scientist. And they hired prostitutes to slip LSD to unsuspecting customers. And then they would bring them up to this room, and the scientists and George White would just watch what happened and take notes. And I'm laughing, but it's awful. It's like a terrible abuse of power. But George White didn't, this sort of person who does this, he didn't have a lot of respect for the rules. And so he kept diaries of this. And this is how we know about Operation Midnight Climax.
Yeah, he is such a fascinating part of the story because he ran the brothel in San Francisco and New York. And like you said, he wrote one of the famous lines from him is working for the CIA lets you pretty much do whatever you want and be above the law. And he was an alcoholic who took all of these drugs himself, who used them to try to seduce women, who dosed people just for the fun of it to test their mettle. He sent one guy in Berlin insane. It was just a guy he was having a drink with, and he slipped him LSD to see what happened. And the guy never recovered his mental health. And this guy just left this trails behind him. It's terrible.
Yeah, I think his quote was like, "Where else can a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, rape, and murder all on the government's dime?" He was a special piece of work.
He was. And he was this big burly guy. And then Sidney Gottlieb was a scientist with a clubfoot, and they couldn't have been more opposite, but they were the two sides of the coin of how evil the pieces of the intelligence agencies could allow themselves to become because they had to beat the Russians, it's hard to remember from this time how important a driving force that would have been.
Yeah. And this is one of the fascinating things about having picked LSD and it's one of the reasons I do tend to poo-poo some of the really utopian narratives about what it's going to do for us, because it doesn't seem to me like it necessarily changes people. It's just, or even more likely, to simply magnify what's already there, right? And so if a person is inside of a very paranoid world that's all about trying to figure out what your enemy's going to do and do it first, that's what LSD is going to bring out and magnify, right? And so there's this very fascinating and wonderful and also very tragic way that I think it actually blows up existing faults and fault lines, right? And so it's a great way to look at the politics of the 60s and 70s and just make it all more than it already was.
That's a great description, a great amplifier of what's present. I know my anarchist buddy, Dimitri Mougianis, who we had on the show a while ago, his line that I think is so true is, if you're an asshole who takes psychedelics, you become a psychedelic asshole.
That sums it up about as well as I can. I love that.
Yeah. And the other story, I can never remember the name, but one of Nixon's goons, the story goes that he took LSD, and that's where he came up with the plan for secretly bombing Cambodia and the best bombing patterns to use to affect change there. And that's how he used LSD. And you even see that today. People are writing about how the alt-right is using psychedelics to further their narrative and to become more creative in how to be better proto-fascists. And I think that it's a real danger to try to clean up and make this a perfect holy drug when it was also what Charlie Manson used to create this cult following.
Yeah, and that's one of the really fascinating things I found about being on Twitter and tweeting about the history of LSD a lot is I mix that up with also complaining about graduate school and tweeting about politics. I try not to tweet about politics a lot, but you can't pretend like it doesn't exist at the moment, and so it happens. And every time I tweet anything even vaguely left-leaning, I lose a couple of followers. And I'm always curious, like, well, what was so offensive about that particular post, right? And so I go look to see who just unfollowed me. And I've definitely been unfollowed by some pretty hardcore white nationalists who had started following me because they're really into psychedelics. And they're out there. They definitely are out there.
And I think that speaks to the last part I wanted to cover with you, which was the 60s, when it really hit, when everything hit. I think and a point of order is that really the 60s started in 1965 is when the protests and acid was really far out there. So I was going to ask you about 1963, because that in some ways was a year when all the major kind of stories had happened. I got a chance to fool around in Timothy Leary's archives of his newspaper clippings. He had a service that was clipping everything related to psychedelics and acid and himself and having it sent to him like you could get done back in those days. And it's in Bruce Damer's DigiBarn in California. And going through the first years of that, 1963 was the year. That was the year that the first toddler accidentally got a dose of LSD. That was in Brooklyn. The first college student threw herself off of a building. And the first time that a guy took acid, and during the trip, he murdered his wife. And then he woke up in jail and he didn't know what had happened. And he had to be told what he had done, which sounds unlikely. But, you know, as crazy as psychedelics can be, you can see that actually happening. And so I'm curious about, how did all of that press coverage and the underground of LSD start affecting these therapists and intelligentsia people that you've been talking about?
So they actually started getting affected most seriously in 1962, which is the year that something called the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments passed. And the typical narrative is that these were passed as a result of the thalidomide fiasco. Thalidomide was a drug that was marketed for morning sickness, and it turns out it created terrible birth defects. But I mentioned earlier the way that pharmaceutical companies would just send out drugs and doctors would test them out on the public and figure out what they were good for after the fact. So this did not work very well in the case of thalidomide. And so the story is that this prompted Senator Kefauver to create these drug amendments that really beefed up the authority of the FDA and started to require controlled clinical trials in drug testing. In reality, he had actually been trying to pass something like that for a long time, even before thalidomide, and thalidomide was really what allowed him to finally push that through. But as part of that, Sandoz freaked out and had been freaking out, frankly, for about a year or two, and starting to get nervous that their reputation was going to be tarnished because of LSD. And so they quietly had been pulling it back from some of their more out there researchers for a while. And in 62, they went full steam into pulling this back. A consequence of that is that it created an underground market for the drug. And some underground chemists, one guy, Bernard Roseman, is the first guy who, to our knowledge, started creating illicit LSD and selling it in the US. He was certainly the first guy who was arrested and put into jail for doing such a thing. His LSD apparently was green, which made a lot of the scientists who'd been using it really nervous. And there's all these letters that they're trading with each other about the green LSD. And this is when they started calling it acid, actually, is as a way to sort of disparage these underground fellows who were making it and hadn't quite perfected their techniques yet. But a lot of them actually started using these clipping services to start collecting all of the terrible stories about, that kid in Brooklyn. I think, was that the one where his father was a cop and he had picked up some LSD on a sugar cube and accidentally left it sitting in a bowl on his desk, and the kid was at the dad's office and ate this sugar cube.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's not the one I remember.
Oh,
Oof.
well, I mean, it could have happened multiple times, but that particular story was one I came across that Sid Cohen had been really troubled by, was the cop's kid who was 3, 5, something like that, quite young. And so the scientists started panicking and also getting the LSD taken away from them quite early in 62, even before it started hitting the public. And so when it did start hitting the public, they knew it wasn't coming from them. And they were not very happy about that fact. And every time anything would go wrong, they would panic a little more of like, oh my God, well, if it's out of our control and these people are doing these really irresponsible things with it, we're never going to get it back. So the scientists actually panicked well before the public panicked. And what I'm finding is that in their efforts to head that off, they may have actually exacerbated the panic in the rest of the public.
Huh. How so?
Well, so a lot of them took to the newspapers or radio interviews or television programming and things of this nature to say, hey, there's this really powerful, incredible drug. We don't know a lot about it yet. We think it has great scientific potential. However, if you take it in the wrong circumstances, it can make you psychotic. So don't take it outside of a doctor's office. And Sid Cohen in particular, his shtick was to make a lot of PSA type films. I don't know if you've ever seen the film LSD, Insight or Insanity. this was quintessential Sid Cohen film. I have another one that I actually found in an archive that they're digitizing for me now called "Can You Hear Me Crying?" And I can't wait to get my hands on it. Cohen was apparently heavily involved in the production. But they essentially overstated its dangers. They didn't make up the dangers. People did go psychotic occasionally, There were in very, very rare cases people who committed suicide on LSD, right? So they weren't making these things up, but they were overstating their likelihood in order to make the case that they should be the ones who had control of LSD. And I think maybe the public was frankly more rational than the scientists themselves, because the public was like, well, that cat's already out of that bag, right? And it's already in the public. We're already watching people go psychotic, And at that point, they were also, not everyone was getting good LSD, right? Some of them were getting the green stuff, or LSD that had been cut with strychnine, for instance, and that had terrible effects, and things that, to be fair, wouldn't have happened if they had taken it in a doctor's office, because they would have been getting clean LSD and they would have been watched over and prevented from harming themselves. But the public knew that once Pandora's box is open, you can't close it again. It didn't seem like you could. And so they believed half the scientist story. They believed the half that said, this is potentially really dangerous. And they did not believe the half that where the scientists said, but we've got it under control, because they clearly didn't. Right? But I think this bit them in the ass, right? This strategy came back to haunt them.
So do you see parallels from that time period and what's happening now with some of the infamous entheogens like MDMA, where the gatekeepers, again, for legal access are going to, at this point, only be psychiatrists or some kind of professional figure, and them being the only ones allowing legal access to these, often very ancient plant medicines or molecules?
I'm not going to lie, it makes me a little nervous. It's a little too reminiscent of what I'm seeing happening back in the 60s. And it's just such a delicately balanced game to play, I think. And yeah, I'm ambivalent, because on the one hand, yes, I think that if you're going to take these sorts of substances, you should get clean, federally tested, and safe drugs, not underground market drugs. And so in that sense, I certainly think they should be controlled. But the idea that only people with a degree are qualified to be good guides, I don't agree with that. I think a good experience comes from being in a situation where the person feels safe and that they're under the watchful eye of someone they can trust. And that doesn't look like a guy in a white lab coat for everybody, right? And so I think this very liberal idea that the only people who can do this safely are people with medical degrees and PhDs is just flat out wrong. And it really misplaces their own trust in themselves and assumes that everyone else must surely also have such trust, and they just don't.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Especially because of the Huxley line that psychiatrists mostly get into this because of their own dark icebergs. And so them being the
true.
gatekeepers, it's a little nerve-wracking. There's been a lot more shamans from various traditions that I would trust than head shrinkers for holding space for a very intense psychedelic experience.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I have a therapist and I adore her very much, and I would trust her to do it. There are other psychiatrists and doctors who I would not trust at all, right? And anyone who studies the history of science for any length of time realizes that a lot of these communities have extremely good reasons for not trusting scientists. I mean, the CIA experiments are a case in point, right? I think you can only take advantage of unwitting people or prisoners to do experiments on, or orphan children or people of color or women for so many years before eventually they're like, yeah, y'all aren't doing science for us, you're doing science for yourselves, and we want something else.
That actually speaks well to the last question I wanted to ask you, which was, from your study of history, what are some of the things that we should be paying attention to today about how these drugs are rolling out and being regulated from what we learned from the last great explosion of them?
I will preface this by saying there are probably people who have studied this much more than I have who have stronger and more serious opinions about it. And you should listen to them and not me.
An academic's take.
This is a non-academic take, right? In my heart of hearts, I'm kind of an anarchist, right? And as a teacher, I find my students do best when I simply point them in the right direction and instill them with faith in themselves and in the process, rather than instilling them with faith in me, right? Like, ideally, my goal as a teacher is that at the end of the semester, they don't need me anymore and I'm useless, right? They're able to do these things themselves and they don't have to be reliant on me. And so if I feel like if there were a way that we could construct access to psychedelics in such a way, like, trust people. Most people, if you show a little trust in them and just give them the guidelines by which they can do a thing safely, and also give them the actual resources, right? You can tell a person how to take drugs safely, but if you make the drugs illegal and they're buying dirty drugs, then there's only so much they can do about that, right? So making sure they have access to the good stuff is certainly important. But then just trust them to be adults and do what needs to be done on their own, right? Most people are not actually looking to destroy their minds permanently. They're not, right? Especially if their lives are pretty good and they're not miserable and unhappy. If they're pretty comfortable, then their reason for doing the drugs is often self-exploration or self-medication or simply to have fun. We always talk about LSD or psychedelics. So often the conversation is about how they improve you as a human being or make you a better worker. That's a weird one now. The guys in Silicon Valley, like, it makes me so creative and I can be a better programmer. Like, I just imagine all these old hippies who passed away rolling over in their graves. But we don't talk about just having fun often enough, right? Maybe someone just wants to enjoy themselves, and I think that should be okay. And if we could create a system that took away the stigma, made it safe, and created safeties, then fuck, just let people do what they want with it. Most of them are going to use it in totally reasonable ways. But maybe this is my lack of cynicism now creeping out, that I do actually have a slightly utopian hope hiding in there somewhere.
Well, that's a beautiful place to end. I really appreciate your take on all of this. And thank you so much for taking the time to share on your studies of this history.
Well, thank you for having me. That was a lot of fun.
Great. All right. And we'll check in next time to get updates as the research continues.
All right. I'll look forward to it.
All right. Great. Thank you again. And until next time. Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, Find us at pluscbdoil.com or on YouTube or on all the podcast platforms. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com or follow the podcast on Twitter at The Lex Files Show. If you enjoyed this program, please rate us on iTunes or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. And our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. Remember the coupon code LEXFILES. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.